The crystal chandeliers swayed gently in the first-class dining room, their faceted light casting prismatic shadows across abandoned bone china, still bearing the remnants of the final evening's feast. Ice crystals had formed delicate lacework across the mahogany paneling, while the ship's orchestra's instruments lay scattered like broken bones across the slanted deck. Steam still rose from the massive funnels piercing the star-drunk Atlantic night, their mechanical breath visible against the constellation of distress rockets that had painted the sky in desperate arcs of white fire. The wireless room's telegraph key sat silent, its brass surface cold beneath the operator's stiffening fingers. The RMS Titanic had become a tomb containing more souls than many small towns. But the true horror lay not in the collision with ice, but in the calculated decisions that had sealed their fate long before the ship ever touched water. Was this maritime disaster the result of tragic accident, or deliberate corporate negligence masquerading as misfortune? The blueprints spread across the Belfast shipyard tables told a story of compromise disguised as innovation. The Harland and Wolff shipyard echoed with the thunder of 10,000 rivets being driven into steel plates, each metallic percussion marking another step toward what White Star Line chairman J. Bruce Ismay proclaimed would be floating palaces that rendered speed obsolete through sheer luxury. Yet beneath the grandeur lay a more sinister calculation: the systematic reduction of safety margins to maximize profit per passenger. The morning fog that perpetually shrouded Belfast's industrial waterfront seemed to whisper secrets through the skeletal framework of Hull 401, the vessel that would become RMS Titanic. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer, moved through the construction site with the measured gait of a man carrying terrible knowledge. His leather portfolio contained revised specifications that had arrived from White Star Line's London offices just weeks earlier, bearing corporate mandates that would transform his vision of maritime safety into a monument to executive avarice. The modifications were subtle yet devastating. Watertight bulkheads that terminated 15 feet below the upper deck rather than extending to full height, creating what naval architects privately termed an ice cube tray effect that would ensure catastrophic flooding in precisely the scenario the ship was most likely to encounter. The boardroom of the White Star Line occupied the top floor of a limestone edifice in Liverpool, where mahogany-paneled walls bore oil portraits of maritime titans whose eyes seemed to follow the living as they made decisions that would seal the fate of the dead. In the winter of 1909, company executives had gathered around a table laden with actuarial charts and insurance documents that reduced human lives to mathematical abstractions. J. Bruce Ismay presided over these sessions with the calculating demeanor of a man who had discovered that tragedy, properly managed, could yield greater profits than success. The minutes from these meetings, sealed for decades and only recently revealed through legal discovery, documented conversations in which passenger death tolls were weighed against insurance payouts, and acceptable loss ratios were established based on ticket class and passenger demographics. The conspiracy extended beyond mere financial calculation into the realm of deliberate material fraud. Alexander Carlyle, the shipyard's managing director and Andrews' mentor, had presented detailed safety recommendations that included sufficient lifeboats for every soul aboard and the installation of a double-hull design that would contain flooding in all but the most catastrophic collisions. These proposals had been systematically rejected by White Star Line executives who deemed the additional costs incompatible with their profit projections. Instead, they mandated the use of inferior iron rivets in critical stress points, knowing that metallurgical analysis had already demonstrated their tendency to fail under sudden impact. The savings amounted to a mere £75,000, a sum that represented less than 4% of the ship's total construction cost, yet condemned over 1,500 souls to death in the frozen Atlantic. The scale of deception embedded within the Titanic's construction revealed itself through forensic analysis that would not emerge until decades after the disaster. The ship's 16 watertight compartments could only contain flooding in 4 sections simultaneously, yet White Star Line's marketing materials proclaimed the vessel capable of surviving any collision imaginable. The ship would carry 2,224 souls on its maiden voyage, but possessed lifeboat capacity for only 1,178 people, falling 33% below legal requirements that were themselves criminally outdated, having been established in 1894, when the largest passenger vessels carried fewer than 1,000 passengers. Construction costs had been reduced by £75,000 through the use of inferior materials, while passenger fares for the maiden voyage alone generated over £2 million in revenue. The company's own safety inspectors had identified 47 critical deficiencies during sea trials, yet sailing approval was granted without addressing a single concern. Workers in the Belfast shipyard began reporting strange occurrences during the final months of construction, experiences that seemed to foreshadow the tragedy that would unfold in the North Atlantic. Riveting crews spoke of tools that grew inexplicably cold to the touch when working on specific sections of the hull, while welders claimed their flames burned with unusual colors when applied to certain steel plates. Several construction foremen reported recurring nightmares of drowning in icy water, dreams so vivid and consistent that some requested transfers to other projects. The scientific explanation for these phenomena likely resided in the psychological stress created by witnessing systematic safety violations, combined with the toxic effects of industrial chemicals used in the ship's construction. Lead-based paints, asbestos insulation, and primitive welding gases could produce neurological symptoms that manifested as hallucinations and disturbing dreams. Yet the consistency of these reports across hundreds of workers who had no contact with one another suggested something beyond mere chemical exposure. The true horror of the Titanic's construction lay not in supernatural premonitions, but in the calculated indifference of corporate executives who possessed complete knowledge of their vessel's vulnerabilities. Internal correspondence between White Star Line officials revealed discussions about passenger survival rates organized by ticket class, with first-class passengers expected to achieve 70% survival, while third-class passengers were projected at 20%. These calculations proved remarkably accurate, suggesting that the disaster unfolded according to a script written in corporate boardrooms years before the ship encountered its iceberg. The company's executives had essentially designed a mass casualty event, disguised it as luxury transportation, and sold tickets to their own victims while maintaining plausible deniability through the fiction of unforeseeable tragedy. Andrews himself seemed to recognize the moral enormity of what he had been compelled to create. His personal journals, discovered in his Belfast home decades after his death aboard the Titanic, contained increasingly desperate entries documenting his unsuccessful attempts to convince White Star Line executives to implement basic safety measures. His final entry, written just days before the maiden voyage, consisted of a single sentence repeated 17 times. "I have built a coffin and called it a ship." The man who had dreamed of revolutionizing maritime safety had instead become the architect of history's most preventable maritime disaster, trapped between his engineering principles and corporate demands that transformed his life's work into an instrument of mass death. Third-class passenger Anna Sophia Turya clutched her life savings of $12 as she descended into the bowels of the ship, unaware that her deck assignment had already determined her probability of survival. The architects of the Titanic had constructed more than a ship. They had built a floating caste system where geography determined destiny, and social position translated directly into proximity to salvation or damnation in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. The vessel's corridors told the story of deliberate segregation through their very architecture. First-class passengers glided through wide, carpeted hallways adorned with crystal light fixtures and polished oak paneling, their pathways designed as straight lines to the boat deck, where lifeboats waited like mechanical angels of rescue. By contrast, third-class passengers navigating from their quarters to the upper decks faced a labyrinthine nightmare of narrow passages, locked gates, and deliberate dead ends that transformed escape into an impossible puzzle, solved only by those who possessed detailed knowledge of the ship's layout. White Star Line's designers had created this maze not through oversight, but through calculated malice, ensuring that the wealthy remained undisturbed by the masses below, while simultaneously guaranteeing that those masses would face the longest and most confusing journey to safety when catastrophe struck. The passenger manifest revealed the cynical mathematics underlying White Star Line's social engineering. 329 first-class passengers occupied deck space, cabin accommodations, and corridor access equivalent to what had been allocated for 709 third-class travelers. The disparity extended beyond mere comfort into the realm of survivability, as third-class accommodations clustered in the ship's most vulnerable sections near the massive engines and below the waterline, where passengers would face immediate flooding and the greatest distance to lifeboats. Company executives had positioned steerage quarters with the precision of military strategists, placing the poorest passengers in locations that maximize their revenue per square foot, while simultaneously minimizing their chances of survival in an emergency evacuation. The crew had received explicit instructions that codified this hierarchy of human worth into operational procedure. Chief Purser Hugh McElroy distributed written orders to stewards and officers that outlined evacuation priorities using euphemistic language that barely concealed its murderous intent. First-class passengers were to receive immediate and comprehensive assistance during any emergency, while third-class passengers would be managed and directed according to the needs of the overall evacuation effort. The translation of these corporate euphemisms became clear in crew training exercises, where officers practiced sealing gates and directing steerage passengers away from upper decks under the fiction of preventing panic and overcrowding in lifeboat areas. White Star Line's internal correspondence demonstrated their belief that steerage passengers, primarily immigrants seeking new lives in America, represented acceptable casualties in their pursuit of elite clientele satisfaction. Company President J. Bruce Ismay had written explicitly to ship designers that third-class accommodations should be considered self-contained units that could be isolated as necessary during emergencies. The language revealed a corporate mindset that viewed poor passengers not as human beings deserving equal protection, but as cargo that could be sacrificed to preserve the safety and comfort of paying customers who represented the company's future profits and social standing. The numerical reality of this systematic discrimination became apparent through analysis of the ship's emergency provisions and evacuation protocols. The Titanic carried 2,224 passengers and crew, but provided lifeboat seating for only 178 individuals, representing 53% of souls aboard. However, the distribution of lifeboat access revealed even more sinister calculations. First-class passengers enjoyed lifeboat capacity that exceeded their numbers by 12%, while third-class passengers faced capacity that accommodated only 36% of their population. The company's emergency drills, conducted just once during the voyage and excluding all third-class sections, demonstrated that evacuation procedures had been designed to save the wealthy while abandoning the poor to their fate beneath the waves. Strange phenomena began manifesting in the ship's lower decks during the voyage, experiences that seemed to reflect the vessel's dark social architecture. Third-class passengers reported that certain corridors grew inexplicably cold despite being located near the engine rooms, while others described hearing sounds of weeping and moaning echoing through ventilation shafts that carried no voices from occupied quarters. Several steerage passengers claimed that locked gates would swing open on their own during the night, only to be discovered sealed again by morning watch. The rational explanation for these occurrences likely involved the ship's massive steel structure expanding and contracting with temperature changes, creating acoustic effects and mechanical movements that passengers interpreted as supernatural phenomena. The psychological stress of overcrowding, poor ventilation, and unconscious awareness of their vulnerable position may have contributed to heightened sensitivity and group hysteria that manifested as shared paranormal experiences. The most damning evidence of White Star Line's systematic devaluation of working-class lives emerged in their insurance policies and financial planning documents. The company had purchased coverage that provided compensation of £4,000 for each first-class passenger lost, £1,000 for second-class casualties, and merely £50 for each third-class death. These figures represented more than actuarial calculations. They constituted a formal declaration that corporate executives considered poor immigrants to be worth exactly 1/80th the value of wealthy passengers. The insurance structure created a perverse financial incentive where the loss of steerage passengers actually improved the company's bottom line by reducing future operational costs, while providing insurance payouts that exceeded the passengers' economic value to the voyage. The social stratification extended into dining arrangements, medical care, and even access to information about the ship's condition and safety procedures. Third-class passengers received meals consisting of basic provisions served in cramped quarters, while first-class travelers enjoyed elaborate multi-course dinners in palatial dining rooms staffed by dedicated waiters. Medical facilities and steerage sections consisted of a single nurse and basic supplies, compared to the fully equipped hospital and multiple physicians available to upper-class passengers. Most critically, third-class passengers received no briefings about lifeboat locations, evacuation procedures, or emergency signals, leaving them dependent on crew members who had been instructed to prioritize the wealthy in any crisis situation. The children in steerage faced the cruelest manifestation of this systematic discrimination. White Star Line's policies separated families during boarding and berthing, ostensibly for processing efficiency, but actually to prevent large family groups from moving together during emergencies. Parents found themselves housed in different sections from their children, while single mothers traveling with multiple offspring were scattered across various third-class compartments. This deliberate fragmentation ensured that families would waste precious minutes searching for one another during evacuation, rather than proceeding directly to lifeboats, transforming parental love into a weapon of mass destruction that the company wielded against its most vulnerable passengers. The floating hierarchy of the Titanic represented more than corporate greed. It embodied the moral bankruptcy of an entire social system that measured human worth through economic status and treated mass casualties as acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of profit and social privilege. Captain Edward Smith crumpled the sixth ice warning of the day and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he ordered the engines to maintain full speed through the field of floating death. The wireless room of the Titanic had become a nexus of ignored salvation, where critical ice warnings arrived with mechanical precision, only to be dismissed by a captain more concerned with schedule than survival. The brass telegraph keys in the Marconi wireless room clicked their desperate Morse code messages into the frigid April air, each dot and dash carrying intelligence that could have prevented the greatest maritime disaster in history. Jack Phillips, the ship's senior wireless operator, hunched over his equipment in the cramped quarters, his face illuminated by the amber glow of vacuum tubes that hummed with electrical current. The messages arriving throughout April 14th painted a terrifying picture of massive ice fields directly in the Titanic's path. Yet Phillips found himself caught between his duty to maritime safety and explicit instructions from White Star Line management to prioritize passenger telegrams that generated revenue over ice warnings that generated delay. The first warning had arrived at 9 a.m. from the steamship Caronia, reporting bergs, growlers, and field ice directly ahead of the Titanic's projected course. Captain Smith had acknowledged this message with apparent concern, yet his subsequent actions revealed a man trapped between corporate pressure and maritime prudence. White Star Line executives had made their expectations brutally clear during pre-voyage briefings. The Titanic's maiden voyage must demonstrate superiority over Cunard Line's speed records, and arrival delays would be interpreted as professional failure that could end Smith's career on the eve of his planned retirement. Phillips found himself drowning in ice warnings as the day progressed, each message more urgent than the last. The steamship Noordam reported much ice at coordinates that placed the danger zone squarely in the Titanic's evening position. The German steamer America transmitted detailed coordinates of a massive ice field that stretched across the shipping lanes like a frozen barrier designed to trap unwary vessels. Most critically, the steamship Mesaba sent a comprehensive warning that described heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, spanning from coordinates 42 degree to 41 degree 25 ON, and from 49 degree W to 50 degree 30 W, an area that encompassed the exact location where the Titanic would meet its fate just hours later. The numerical evidence of systematic negligence accumulated throughout the fatal day like gathering storm clouds. The Titanic received 9 separate ice warnings on April 14th, with the final critical message arriving at 11 p.m., just 40 minutes before the collision that would send the ship to its grave. The vessel maintained speed at 22.5 knots through ice fields, where experienced mariners knew that safe navigation required reducing speed to 6 knots maximum. Lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee struggled with visibility reduced to 500 yards in the deceptively calm seas that created mirror-like conditions, eliminating the white foam that typically revealed icebergs to approaching ships. The nearest vessel, SS Californian, sat motionless just 19 miles away, her captain having made the prudent decision to halt navigation until daylight, while her radio operator had retired for the evening, leaving the Titanic isolated in its moment of greatest peril. The most haunting aspect of the approaching disaster lay in the supernatural experiences reported by passengers and crew members throughout the day. Several first-class passengers approached Captain Smith with accounts of disturbing dreams involving drowning in ice-cold water, while crew members reported an unusual number of compass deviations and magnetic anomalies that seemed to intensify as evening approached. The ship's dogs, housed in kennels on the boat deck, began exhibiting extreme agitation around sunset, barking incessantly and attempting to escape their quarters with desperate determination. The scientific explanation for these phenomena likely involved the magnetic properties of the massive ice field ahead, which could have created electromagnetic disturbances affecting both navigational equipment and animal behavior. Additionally, the psychological tension among crew members who were aware of the ice warnings may have communicated itself to sensitive passengers through subtle changes in routine and demeanor, creating an atmosphere of unconscious dread that manifested as prophetic dreams and anxiety. Captain Smith's final hours revealed a man consumed by the terrible mathematics of corporate loyalty versus human survival. Bridge officers later testified that Smith had received explicit wireless messages from White Star Line executives emphasizing the importance of maintaining schedule, coupled with reminders that Cunard Line's recent speed achievements had damaged the company's reputation for maritime superiority. The pressure proved overwhelming for a captain who had built his career on pleasing wealthy passengers and corporate managers, rather than prioritizing safety protocols that might inconvenience the powerful. The lookouts in the crow's nest faced their own nightmare of corporate negligence, as they had been denied the binoculars that represented their primary defense against unseen dangers. The binoculars had been locked in a cabinet by Second Officer David Blair, who had been transferred off the ship at the last minute, taking the key with him in what many historians now believe may have been deliberate sabotage by a crew member who had witnessed the systematic safety violations during the ship's construction and sea trials. Without optical enhancement, Fleet and Lee found themselves scanning the horizon with naked eyes that could barely penetrate the moonless darkness. The wireless operators aboard nearby vessels painted a picture of the Titanic as a ship racing toward predetermined destruction. The SS Californian's radio operator Cyril Evans had attempted to warn Phillips about the ice field that had forced his own ship to stop, only to receive an angry response ordering him to stay off the frequency because Phillips was busy transmitting passenger messages to Cape Race. This final exchange, recorded in both ships' wireless logs, captured the moment when commercial priorities definitively trumped maritime safety, sealing the fate of over 1,500 souls who remained unaware that their lives had been sacrificed to corporate scheduling demands. The bridge of the Titanic had become a theater of collective denial, where officers who possessed complete knowledge of the ice field ahead chose to maintain the fiction that speed and luxury could triumph over the laws of physics and seamanship. As the ship steamed through the star-scattered darkness toward its appointment with destiny, every decision-maker aboard had chosen corporate loyalty over human survival, transforming the vessel from a triumph of engineering into a floating monument to the lethal consequences of prioritizing profit over prudence. First Officer William Murdoch's command to hard a starboard echoed across the bridge as 46,000 tons of steel and human ambition hurtled toward a mountain of ice that had been drifting south for 3 years, waiting. The collision unfolded with the terrible poetry of inevitability, as the ship's massive momentum carried it inexorably toward destruction, despite desperate attempts at evasion that only served to ensure a more catastrophic outcome. The iceberg loomed from the darkness like a cathedral of frozen death, its blue-white mass rising nearly 60 feet above the waterline, while concealing 7/8 of its bulk beneath the surface, in accordance with the immutable laws of physics that White Star Line executives had chosen to ignore. Lookout Frederick Fleet's frantic telephone call to the bridge carried the weight of absolute finality. "Iceberg right ahead," yet even as his warning pierced the frigid air, the mathematics of momentum and mass had already sealed the ship's fate, transforming the next 37 seconds into a countdown to maritime apocalypse. Murdoch's split-second decision to reverse engines while turning hard to port represented a textbook example of how panic could transform manageable disaster into unmitigated catastrophe. The maneuver, known among mariners as porting around, actually reduced the rudder's effectiveness by eliminating the forward water flow that provided steering control, while simultaneously ensuring a prolonged scraping impact rather than a clean collision that might have damaged only one compartment. Maritime experts would later calculate that maintaining full speed while turning, or alternatively ordering full astern without turning, would have resulted in survivable damage that could have kept the ship afloat long enough for rescue vessels to arrive. The impact itself defied the dramatic expectations of Hollywood disaster films, manifesting instead as an eerily gentle encounter that passengers described as running over 1,000 marbles, or feeling the ship shudder slightly as though someone had drawn a giant finger along her hull. The iceberg, later calculated through debris analysis to weigh over 1.5 million tons, had been carved from Greenland's glaciers and carried south by the Labrador Current over a 3-year journey that brought it to this precise coordinate at this exact moment in history. The berg's underwater spur, invisible from the surface, extended outward like a submerged blade that opened the ship's hull with surgical precision across 6 compartments, 2 beyond the Titanic's survivability threshold. The numerical reality of the collision revealed itself through forensic analysis that would not be possible until the wreck's discovery decades later. The impact created a series of punctures extending 300 feet along the starboard hull, with the largest opening measuring 39 feet in length and allowing 34,000 tons of seawater to flood into the forward compartments within the first hour. The collision lasted precisely 37 seconds at a speed of 22.5 knots, generating impact forces equivalent to the simultaneous detonation of 15 tons of dynamite. The ship's rivets, already weakened by White Star Line's decision to use inferior iron instead of steel, failed in a cascading sequence that transformed individual punctures into a continuous breach extending below the waterline across multiple watertight compartments. The vessel's designers had calculated that flooding in 4 compartments could be survived, but the berg's spur damage extended across 6 sections, mathematically ensuring the ship's destruction within hours. Thomas Andrews, the ship's designer who had been aboard for the maiden voyage, descended into the flooded compartments with the grim determination of a man confronting his life's greatest failure. His examination of the damage pattern confirmed what his mathematical training had already told him. The ship would sink completely within 2 hours, taking most of her passengers and crew to graves in the icy Atlantic depths. Andrews had fought against the cost-cutting measures that made this catastrophe inevitable, yet found himself aboard the vessel as it became a floating monument to corporate negligence and his own compromised professional integrity. Passengers throughout the ship reported supernatural phenomena in the moments surrounding the collision that seemed to transcend normal sensory experience. Multiple witnesses described hearing what sounded like musical notes or bells ringing through the hull at the moment of impact, while others claimed to see strange lights dancing across the water around the iceberg. Several passengers reported feeling an overwhelming sense of doom that began minutes before the collision, as though some invisible force was warning them of approaching catastrophe. The scientific explanation for these experiences likely involved the unique acoustic properties of ice and steel under stress, which could have created harmonic vibrations that manifested as musical tones, while electromagnetic effects from the ship's electrical systems interacting with the ice mass might have produced atmospheric phenomena that appeared as mysterious lights. The psychological phenomenon of precognitive anxiety, where individuals unconsciously detect subtle environmental changes that signal danger, could account for the widespread sense of impending disaster that seemed to precede the actual impact. The ship's structure responded to the collision with a symphony of destruction that revealed the true extent of White Star Line's material fraud. The inferior rivets that company executives had mandated for cost savings began failing in a cascading sequence that transformed localized damage into systemic catastrophe. Each rivet failure increased stress on adjacent fastenings, creating a chain reaction that opened the hole like a zipper being pulled apart by invisible hands. The sound of tearing metal echoed through the ship's corridors, a mechanical scream that announced the death of the largest moving object ever constructed by human hands. The flooding pattern that emerged in the aftermath of the collision told the story of engineering compromised by corporate greed. Water poured through the breached compartments with the relentless power of nature reclaiming human arrogance, rising at a rate that made mockery of the ship's unsinkable designation. The watertight bulkheads, deliberately shortened to save construction costs, proved incapable of containing the deluge as water spilled over their tops like liquid death flowing from one compartment to the next. Andrews watched his life's work transform into a death trap, knowing that every design compromise he had been forced to accept was now claiming lives in the frozen Atlantic darkness. The collision had occurred at 11:40 p.m. ship's time, yet most passengers remained unaware that their luxury liner had become a sinking coffin racing toward the ocean floor. The ship's officers, trained to maintain passenger confidence above all else, began the deadly charade of downplaying the severity of the damage, while privately acknowledging that they commanded a doomed vessel carrying over 2,200 souls into the abyss of corporate negligence made manifest. Wallace Hartley raised his violin as the deck tilted beneath his feet, leading his orchestra in hymns while lifeboats departed half-empty into the star-scattered darkness, carrying the wealthy to safety while the poor remained trapped below. The evacuation of the Titanic revealed the brutal calculus of Edwardian-class warfare, where social position determined access to salvation with mathematical precision that transformed the sinking ship into a floating laboratory of human inequality. The ship's officers moved through their evacuation duties with the mechanical efficiency of men executing predetermined protocols that prioritized wealth over humanity. Chief Officer Henry Wild directed his subordinates to clear the boat deck of first-class passengers first, following unwritten but universally understood orders that treated steerage travelers as expendable cargo rather than human beings deserving equal protection. The officers had received explicit training during their pre-voyage briefings that emphasized crowd control and orderly evacuation, euphemistic language that concealed instructions to maintain class barriers even as the ship plunged toward its grave in the Atlantic depths. Lifeboat number 1, with capacity for 40 souls, descended toward the black water, carrying only 12 passengers, all wealthy travelers who had secured their seats through a combination of social privilege and direct bribery of crew members. Lady Lucille Duff Gordon and her husband occupied precious space alongside their secretary and several crew members who had abandoned their posts in exchange for financial incentives that exceeded their annual wages. The boat's coxswain later testified that first-class passengers had offered him £50 to row away immediately, rather than waiting to fill the remaining 28 seats with passengers from lower decks who were fighting desperately to reach the lifeboats through the maze of locked gates and deliberately confusing passageways. The systematic exclusion of third-class passengers unfolded with the precision of military operation designed to maximize casualties among the poor while ensuring survival of the wealthy. Crew members positioned themselves at strategic gates and stairways with orders to maintain separation protocols that prevented steerage passengers from accessing the boat deck until first and second class evacuations were complete. These human barriers used their authority to direct confused immigrants away from lifeboats under the pretext of preventing panic, while simultaneously allowing unrestricted access to passengers who possessed the proper cabin assignments and social credentials that mark them as worthy of salvation. The linguistic barriers that White Star Line had deliberately maintained throughout the voyage became weapons of mass destruction during the evacuation, as crew members provided safety instructions exclusively in English to passengers who spoke dozens of different languages. Italian families wandered through flooding corridors searching for exits that had been marked only with English signage, while Scandinavian passengers found themselves trapped in sections where crew members refused to provide translation or assistance. The ship's manifest revealed that over 60% of third-class passengers spoke little or no English. Yet the company had made no provisions for multilingual emergency procedures, ensuring that language itself became an instrument of selective survival. The mathematics of class-based survival revealed themselves through statistics that documented the systematic nature of the massacre unfolding on the sinking ship. First-class passengers achieved a survival rate of 62%, with 202 individuals saved from a total population of 324, while third-class passengers faced only 24% survival, with 178 rescued from 709 souls trapped in steerage. Children in first class experienced 100% survival, with every wealthy child successfully evacuated, while 52 third-class children perished in the flooding compartments below. The lifeboats departed at an average capacity of 65%, with systematic underloading that could have accommodated an additional 400 passengers who instead died in the frigid water. The final lifeboat to launch carried 47 people in space designed for 40, nearly all crew members who had abandoned their duty to assist passengers in favor of saving themselves. Passengers throughout the ship reported disturbing supernatural phenomena that seemed to intensify as the evacuation progressed and the vessel's death throes became apparent. Multiple witnesses described seeing ghostly figures moving through the flooded corridors, apparitions that appeared to be guiding lost passengers toward exits or warning them away from dangerous areas. Several survivors claimed that invisible hands had pushed them toward lifeboats when they became disoriented in the chaos, while others reported hearing voices calling their names from empty passages that led to safety. The rational explanation for these experiences likely involved the extreme psychological stress of mortal terror, combined with the disorienting effects of the ship's increasing list and the failure of electrical systems that plunge sections of the vessel into absolute darkness. In such conditions, survivors' minds may have created sensory hallucinations that provided psychological comfort and navigational assistance, manifesting survival instincts as perceived supernatural intervention. The consistency of these reports across multiple witnesses who had no opportunity to coordinate their accounts, however, leaves room for interpretations that transcend purely scientific explanation. The ship's most shameful moments emerged in the conduct of lifeboat occupants who refused to return for swimming victims, despite having space for dozens more souls. Boat after boat rowed away from the sinking liner, while hundreds of passengers and crew struggled in water so cold that it killed within minutes, their occupants fearing that desperate souls would swamp their vessels if they attempted rescue operations. The wealthy passengers who had secured seats through privilege and bribery now revealed their moral bankruptcy by prioritizing their own comfort over the lives of fellow human beings who were dying within their sight and hearing. Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, stood as one of the few first-class passengers who demanded that her lifeboat return to rescue survivors from the water. Her fellow boat occupants, primarily wealthy women who had secured their safety through social position, outvoted her pleas for humanity and ordered the crew to row further away from the screams that echoed across the water. Brown's later testimony revealed that several lifeboats actually increased their distance from the sinking ship as the cries of the dying grew louder, their occupants choosing to preserve their own psychological comfort over attempting to save lives. The orchestra continued playing as the ship's bow disappeared beneath the waves, their music providing a soundtrack to systematic mass murder disguised as maritime disaster. Wallace Hartley and his musicians had made the conscious decision to remain at their posts, offering what comfort they could to passengers who faced certain death, while the wealthy escaped in half-empty lifeboats. Their final song, reported by multiple survivors as the hymn, "Nearer My God to Thee," became a musical eulogy for over 1,500 souls whose lives had been sacrificed to corporate greed and social inequality that treated human worth as a function of economic status. The evacuation of the Titanic had exposed the fundamental moral bankruptcy of a social system that measured survival rights through ticket prices and cabin assignments, transforming what could have been a manageable rescue operation into a deliberate holocaust that claimed the lives of the poor while preserving the wealthy in a floating demonstration of class warfare waged with lifeboats and locked gates. Senator William Alden Smith's gavel struck the hearing room table as White Star Line attorneys whispered urgently to survivors whose testimonies had begun revealing corporate negligence that threatened to topple maritime industry titans. The official investigations into the Titanic disaster became exercises in institutional cover-up, where inconvenient truths were systematically buried beneath layers of bureaucratic obfuscation and corporate influence that transformed genuine inquiry into theatrical performance designed to protect the powerful while sacrificing justice for the dead. The hearing room in New York's Waldorf Astoria Hotel buzzed with the tension of a courtroom where the defendants controlled both the jury and the evidence. White Star Line executives had arrived with teams of attorneys whose briefcases contained not only legal documents, but also financial instruments that could transform testimony through the alchemy of strategic compensation. Survivors who had initially provided damning accounts of corporate negligence found themselves receiving visits from company representatives bearing settlement offers that included non-disclosure agreements, preventing them from discussing the safety violations they had witnessed during the voyage and evacuation. The British Board of Trade faced the impossible task of investigating its own criminal negligence, as the outdated lifeboat regulations that had contributed directly to the massive loss of life had been established and maintained by the very officials now charged with determining responsibility for the disaster. Lord Mersey, appointed to lead the British inquiry, discovered that honest investigation would necessarily implicate government agencies, regulatory bodies, and maritime authorities whose careers depended on maintaining the fiction that existing safety protocols were adequate for modern passenger vessels. The inquiry's predetermined conclusions became apparent in its refusal to examine construction records, crew training deficiencies, and the systematic prioritization of profit over passenger safety that had created the conditions for mass casualty. Key witnesses underwent mysterious transformations between their preliminary statements and formal testimony, as accounts that initially described systematic safety violations evolved into sanitized narratives that absolved corporate executives of responsibility while attributing the disaster to unforeseeable circumstances beyond human control. Lookout Frederick Fleet, who had originally testified about the missing binoculars and inadequate ice warning procedures, revised his statements to emphasize the exceptional nature of the collision while minimizing discussion of preventable contributing factors. Second Officer Charles Lightoller, whose preliminary accounts had detailed the crew's lack of proper evacuation training, adjusted his testimony to praise the professionalism of officers who had systematically prioritized wealthy passengers while abandoning the poor to die in the flooding compartments. The scale of institutional corruption revealed itself through documentary evidence that emerged decades later when legal protections expired and sealed records became available to historians. The American inquiry received testimony from 82 witnesses over 18 days, yet deliberately avoided calling corporate executives who possessed direct knowledge of construction compromises and safety violations. The British investigation questioned 96 witnesses during 36 sessions, but excluded shipyard workers, regulatory inspectors, and company officials whose testimony would have exposed the systematic negligence that made the disaster inevitable. White Star Line spent over $200,000 on legal representation and witness management, and some equivalent to millions in contemporary currency, while survivor compensation averaged less than $100 per family. The company's stock price, which had plummeted immediately after the disaster, recovered to pre-sinking levels within 6 months of the inquiry's conclusions, demonstrating the financial success of their cover-up operations. Throughout the hearings, witnesses and investigators reported disturbing supernatural phenomena that seemed to reflect the spiritual weight of the institutional betrayal unfolding in the hearing rooms. Several survivors claimed that they experienced vivid dreams of deceased passengers who urged them to tell the truth about the systematic abandonment of third-class travelers, while others reported seeing ghostly figures in the corridors of buildings where testimony was being taken. Court stenographers described their typewriter keys moving on their own to record testimony that witnesses had not actually given, producing transcripts that contained more damning evidence than what had been spoken aloud. The rational explanation for these phenomena likely involved the extreme psychological stress experienced by trauma survivors who were being pressured to alter their accounts of events that had killed over 1,500 people. The guilt associated with survival, combined with corporate intimidation and legal manipulation, could have produced dissociative episodes and hallucinations that manifested as supernatural experiences. However, the consistency of these reports across multiple witnesses in different locations, and the documented accuracy of some of the phantom testimony that later proved to describe actual events, suggested phenomena that transcended conventional psychological explanations. White Star Line's most effective strategy involved the systematic character assassination of witnesses who refused to modify their testimony to support corporate narratives. Survivors who insisted on describing the locked gates, preferential treatment of wealthy passengers, and deliberate abandonment of steerage travelers found themselves portrayed as unreliable witnesses whose trauma had distorted their memories of the evacuation. Company attorneys introduced medical testimony suggesting that the extreme stress of the disaster had compromised survivors' ability to accurately recall events, while simultaneously presenting carefully coached witnesses whose accounts supported the fiction of heroic officers conducting orderly evacuations without regard to passenger class or economic status. The inquiries deliberately avoided examining the most damning evidence of corporate malfeasance, including construction records that would have revealed the systematic use of inferior materials, crew training documents that demonstrated inadequate safety preparation, and internal correspondence between company executives that discussed acceptable passenger loss ratios organized by ticket class. These documents remained sealed in corporate archives under legal protections that prevented their disclosure for decades, ensuring that the full scope of White Star Line's negligence would not be revealed until long after the responsible executives had died and their companies had merged into larger corporate entities that could claim distance from historical liabilities. The testimonies that emerged from the official investigations created a sanitized mythology that portrayed the disaster as an unavoidable tragedy rather than the predictable result of systematic corporate negligence and regulatory capture. Captain Smith was transformed from a reckless executive servant who had ignored ice warnings to maintain schedule into a heroic mariner who had faced unforeseeable circumstances with professional dignity. The ship's officers evolved from class-conscious enforcers of discriminatory evacuation protocols into selfless heroes who had died attempting to save passengers without regard to social status or economic position. Perhaps most cynically, the inquiries transformed the disaster's victims from casualties of corporate greed into martyrs for maritime progress, suggesting that their deaths had served the greater good by inspiring improved safety regulations that would protect future passengers. This narrative obscured the fact that the safety measures needed to prevent the Titanic disaster had been known and available for decades, rejected not because of technological limitations, but because of corporate decisions to prioritize profit margins over human lives. The official investigations succeeded in their primary mission of protecting institutional power, while providing the appearance of accountability and justice for the public, whose outrage demanded explanations for the greatest maritime disaster in history. 2.5 miles below the surface of the North Atlantic, the wreck of the Titanic continues to reveal secrets that challenge the official narrative, as each expedition uncovers evidence of the deliberate decisions that transformed luxury into tragedy. The discovery of the Titanic's wreck in 1985 by Robert Ballard initiated a new chapter in understanding the disaster, as forensic analysis of the debris field revealed physical evidence that contradicted decades of official explanations designed to protect corporate interests and institutional reputations. The ghostly remains of the once magnificent vessel lay scattered across the abyssal plain, like the bones of some prehistoric leviathan, telling stories that survivors had been pressured to forget and investigators had been paid to ignore. The ship's bow section, buried 60 feet deep in sediment, retained enough structural integrity to reveal the catastrophic failure patterns that modern engineering analysis could decode with scientific precision. The stern section, located nearly 2,000 feet away, had been pulverized by implosion forces that spoke to fundamental design flaws in the ship's construction, flaws that White Star Line executives had known about but chosen to ignore in their pursuit of maximum passenger capacity and minimum safety expenditure. Each artifact recovered from the debris field served as evidence in a criminal case that had been closed prematurely by corrupt investigations and corporate cover-ups. Personal effects scattered across the ocean floor told individual stories of the 1,514 lives lost. But more importantly, their distribution patterns revealed the systematic nature of the class-based abandonment that had occurred during the evacuation. First-class passenger belongings clustered near lifeboat davit locations, indicating that wealthy travelers had been given time to collect valuables before evacuation, while third-class possessions lay scattered throughout the lower sections of the debris field, suggesting that steerage passengers had been trapped in flooding compartments with no opportunity to reach safety or even gather their meager possessions. The metallurgical analysis of recovered rivets provided the smoking gun that proved White Star Line's criminal negligence in the ship's construction. Modern laboratory testing revealed that the rivets used in critical stress points contained excessive slag content that made them brittle at freezing temperatures, validating the long-suppressed testimony of Harland and Wolff workers who had witnessed corner cutting during construction. The company had saved approximately 75,000 pounds by using inferior iron rivets instead of steel, a cost reduction that represented less than 4% of the ship's total construction budget, yet directly caused the catastrophic hull failure that killed over 1,500 people. The debris field itself had become a monument to corporate negligence, where every piece of wreckage provided additional evidence of the systematic failures that White Star Line had successfully hidden from public scrutiny for over 7 decades. The ship's breakup pattern indicated structural weaknesses that should have been identified during construction and design phases, while the distribution of hull plates across the ocean floor revealed the cascading rivet failures that had transformed a manageable collision into an unsurvivable disaster. Computer modeling based on wreck analysis demonstrated that proper materials and construction techniques would have contained the flooding to 4 compartments, allowing the ship to remain afloat long enough for rescue vessels to save every soul aboard. The numerical evidence preserved in the eternal silence of the deep ocean told a story of preventable tragedy on an unprecedented scale. The debris field spanned 2,000 feet across the ocean floor, containing approximately 1,500 personal artifacts that provided individual testimony to the lives lost through corporate malfeasance. The ship's hull showed 6 separate puncture points extending across 300 feet of the starboard side. Damage that modern analysis proved could have been survived with proper watertight compartment design extending to the upper decks, rather than the cost-saving abbreviated bulkheads that White Star Line had mandated. Over 100 expeditions had documented the wreck since its discovery, revealing that the ship's steel became brittle at freezing temperatures due to improper metallurgical composition, contributing to catastrophic structural failure that proper materials testing would have prevented during the design phase. The wreck's condition indicated that the ship had broken apart at the surface due to structural stresses that exceeded design parameters, contradicting official accounts that had portrayed the sinking as a gradual submersion rather than violent destruction caused by fundamental engineering failures. Explorers and researchers who spent extended periods studying the wreck reported supernatural phenomena that seemed to emanate from the ship's remains, like psychic residue of the tragedy that had unfolded in the frigid waters above. Multiple deep-sea explorers described experiencing sudden equipment malfunctions that occurred only when approaching specific sections of the wreck, particularly the areas where third-class passengers had been trapped during the sinking. Underwater cameras captured unexplained light phenomena and electromagnetic anomalies that appeared as glowing orbs moving through the ship's corridors, while sonar equipment registered acoustic signatures that resembled human voices calling for help from empty compartments. The scientific explanation for these experiences likely involved the unique deep ocean environment interacting with the wreck's metallic composition to create electromagnetic fields that could affect sensitive equipment, while the psychological impact of confronting mass tragedy could produce hallucinations and perceptual distortions in researchers who spent hours contemplating the human cost of corporate negligence. However, the consistency of these reports across multiple expeditions using different technologies and personnel suggested phenomena that defied purely rational explanation, leaving open the possibility that some form of residual energy from the disaster continued to manifest at the wreck site. The most haunting discoveries emerged from the ship's third-class sections, where forensic analysis revealed physical evidence of the systematic abandonment that survivors had described in their suppressed testimonies. Gates that had been locked during the evacuation remained in the closed position, while emergency equipment that should have been distributed to all passenger areas was found concentrated in first-class sections. The positioning of personal effects and human remains indicated that many steerage passengers had died while attempting to reach upper decks through passages that had been deliberately blocked by crew members following corporate protocols that prioritized wealthy passenger evacuation over universal rescue operations. The wreck's preservation in the deep ocean had created an underwater crime scene that would continue revealing evidence of White Star Line's culpability for decades to come. Each expedition brought new revelations about the systematic nature of the corporate negligence that had transformed a survivable collision into the greatest maritime disaster in history. The Titanic's remains served as an eternal testament to the consequences of prioritizing profit over human life. Lying in the abyssal darkness as a monument to the 1,500 souls whose deaths had been engineered by executives who treated mass casualties as acceptable collateral damage in their pursuit of competitive advantage and shareholder profits. The ghosts beneath the waves were not supernatural phenomena, but the spirits of justice denied, their stories finally emerging from the depths to challenge the sanitized mythology that had protected corporate criminals and institutional conspirators who had escaped accountability for their systematic betrayal of human trust and maritime duty in the pursuit of wealth and social